calls us to live as Christians, then if we truly take that to heart, then sometimes we might look a little strange, a little off to the rest of the world. And that's kind of been our theme through this series. Peter is he's telling Christians sometimes you're going to feel like out of place. You're going to feel like a stranger or an alien because you're living to a different set of standards. You're doing things that the world doesn't necessarily totally understand. When we talk about things like love your enemies, we're talking about things like whoever wants to be great must be a servant. When we talk about things like sacrificial giving and giving to the God's kingdom, and we talk about don't let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouth. Talk about the first shall be last and the last shall be first. When we truly start living like that, it looks a little odd. It looks a little strange sometimes to the rest of the world. Sometimes we might feel like a stranger. Sometimes the world might look at us like we're a little different. And that is kind of a theme that permeates through 1 Peter. He's trying to encourage them that that's okay. Sometimes we may feel like we don't fit into this world. When we see this world's values, we see the direction things seem to be headed, and so we to the rest of the world, we might seem out of place. So as Peter's going along in chapter 3, he talks about marriage. He gives some instructions about marriage, some instructions to wives and some instruction to husbands about marriage as a Christian. And I wasn't sure what to call the title of today's sermon, but what I landed on is we're going to call it Strange Marriages. And the idea is it's not that marriage is strange, but that if we truly model what a biblical marriage is, sometimes the world might look at us like we're strange, because even marriage can become so self-centered, and it becomes about my convenience and my feelings, and if my needs are being met, and it's all about me, and it's disposable, and if it's not working out, we can walk away. But to truly live and be the kind of spouse that God calls us to be, it can look a little strange, perhaps, to the world. And we're not going to cover today everything that the Bible says about marriage. That would take several weeks. This series is not about marriage, but it's about 1 Peter. So we're going to try to just limit ourselves to what this passage says about being a wife, being a husband. And it's an intimidating topic to do when your wife's in the audience. So I tried to get her to go to the nursery today, but she wouldn't do it. Right? So anyway, so we're going to start where Peter starts, and he starts talking to the wives. So strange wives, and just kind of if you're the outline filler outer, obviously, if all you walk away from today is an outline that says strange wives and strange husbands, then that's going to be very interesting to explain to anybody else that you show your notes to. So I left a lot of blanks, a lot of space for you to fill in some of the details. But we're going to talk about wives. Let's look at 1 Peter chapter 3. And we're going to start with the first two verses. Peter says, "Wives, in the same way, be submissive to your husbands, so that if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives, when they see the purity and reverence of your lives." All right, so we're going to stop there. Let's start at the very beginning. It says, "Well, wives in the same way," or maybe your version says likewise. Wives likewise. So when we see that, in the same way as what? So we got to kind of look back. Even though we're in chapter 3, that little number 3 didn't exist when Peter wrote this. He didn't sit there and write big number 3, little number 1, little number 2, right? This was just a letter. So he says, likewise, what was he talking about before then? And so when we flip back to chapter 2, what he ends with is he's talking about Jesus. He's talking about Jesus' example of humility, how Jesus came not to be served, but to serve. He humbled himself, became a man, and even was willing to die for those that he loved. He did not retaliate when his attackers attacked him. It's talking about his attitude, the attitude that Jesus had when he came to serve us. And so that's what that, in the same way as Jesus had that attitude, That's the attitude he's called for. Wives, but let's be true. Let's spoiler alert to the end. Let's be true. He asked the same of husbands. That we are all to consider Christ's example and to follow Christ's example of humility. So he says, likewise, in the same way, be submissive to your husbands, so that if any of them do not believe. So the way that for Peter to word this the way it does, it shows us that in his audience, there were likely very many Christian women who were married to unbelievers. It was enough of an issue that he phrases it this way and says that, well, you might be able to win your husband who does not believe. It says the words, my versions there, do not believe the word, but it's talking about do not believe the gospel. Do not believe the gospel. So either, more than likely, these women were already married, and then they came to know Christ. This is when the church was just starting to grow and become a thing, and going through city to city, being preached, and people were being baptized. And so as the church grew, a lot of women were receptive to that. And so these women are married to non-Christians, married to unbelievers, and so Peter is addressing that. And today, we still see kind of that similar trend. I think we see more women being spiritually receptive than we do men. And we kind of look around in our churches, we can look around in our Bible studies and things, and we can see that. We can see a lot of maybe not a lot, but I think you can see definitely women coming to church whose husbands are staying at home, and maybe they're believers, maybe they're not believers, but not making church a priority, instead of staying at home, finding other things to do, instead of being here with God's people. So I think we kind of can still see that the women put us to shame sometimes in terms of the church and where the church is concerned. And I was reading this study that from Focus on the Family, and it said that if a child, it's talking about the first person to become a Christian. So if the child of the household is the first one to become a Christian, then there's only a 3.5% chance that the rest of the people in the household will follow, will become converted, will be saved, based on the relationship with the child. That's not to say that's not possible. I mean, I was a Christian. I became a Christian and was saved before my father, and my influence on my father led him to Christ. So it's not saying that it's not possible, but if the child is the first one to accept Christ, then that percentage is down, and that makes sense, because the parents are the authority, and the child is submissive to them. If the mother is the first one to become a Christian, there's a 17% chance that the rest of the household will follow her example and find salvation. So again, it's not saying that can't happen. It's just say that's the percentage, that's the probability when the mother of a household is the first convert. If the father is the first one, it jumps all the way to 93%. There's a 93% probability that everybody else in the household will give their faith, will become saved, will become Christians based on the father's leadership and the father's example. It jumps all the way to 93%. So we can't ignore the fact that the spiritual role of men is a thing, and it is important, and not all families have that, and again, God works and God moves in all these different ways. There's nothing impossible for God, but just looking at the numbers just reminds us how important it is, the spirituality of our men and how important that is. But we're not supposed to be on husbands yet, so let's get back to wives, right? Peter is saying here that these unbelieving spouses would be more likely won over not with words, but behavior. Actions speak louder than words. Somebody should really come up coin that as a saying. Actions speak louder than words. So he's saying by your behavior is the way to win over an unbelieving spouse. And it's not going to be about preaching at them. It's not going to be about getting onto them. But it's like, but in a submissive attitude, that humble attitude of Christ, live a life, live out your faith, and let that be your example. And that's no different than Peter was telling us in chapter 2 about the world in general. with government authorities and people that are persecuting the church, live your life in such a way that even if they try to find something wrong with you, they're going to end up glorifying God because of the way you're living your life. And so it's really no different, even though he's singling out wives here. Behavior. Action speaks much louder than words. Now we have to at least address the dirty word in this verse, and that word submissive. That word submit. That's not very popular. This idea of submission of wives has kind of given the church a black eye and a bad reputation. I mean, it's definitely an idea that the world would see it as strange and as not very popular. Has this idea been abused by men? Absolutely it has throughout history. This idea has been abused by men, even within the church. Have women had to fight for their place at the table in a lot of different areas? Absolutely, they have. But the negative from this word submission really comes from a misunderstanding and a misinterpreting of this biblical view of submission. For us, submission, it's got a bad taste in our mouths, but the way the word was intended is not so. When the Bible talks about wives submitting to their husband, it's comparing them to Christ. So it's not talking about a position of weakness or inferiority. It's actually, no one has a higher place in the Bible than Christ. I mean, his place in the Bible is as high as you can get. And when he's talking about submission, it always calls back to the example that Jesus gave. So it's not talking about weakness or inferiority. It's talking about a position of strength and being strong enough to submit. Being strong enough, it's about an attitude of humbleness. The biblical view is not that wives are less valued, less important, that they don't have as much of a voice, they don't have as much of an influence, but it's about an attitude that they bring to the table. It's an attitude that is Christ-like. In Matthew chapter 20, verses 25 to 28, Jesus says, and he's saying this to everybody, he's not singling out women, he says, Jesus called them together and said, "Do you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them? Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to be great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." So this is not about a position of weakness, but it's about unconditional love. It's about an unconditional commitment, and it's about a humble service, like Christ himself is an example of. It has more to do with attitude than authority. We want to make it about authority, but it's really about attitude. It's not so much about who calls the shots, but it's about how disagreements are handled. It's about the attitude that's brought to the table. We can say more about that, but I really want to move on. We've got a lot to cover, so we're going to move on to the next couple of verses. And Peter talks about beauty. He says, "Your beauty should not come from outward adornment, such as braided hair, the wearing of gold jewelry, and fine clothes. Instead, it should be that of your inner self, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is of great worth in God's sight." And then he goes on to give the example of Sarah from the Old Testament, which these people would have looked up to as, the mother of the faith. So let's talk about it. First of all, let's talk about what this is not saying. Okay, this is not God's dress code for women. Okay, it's not saying that you can't wear gold jewelry and you can't braid your hair. This is not a dress code. That's not what this verse is saying. And actually, one reason we know this is in the original Greek. There is no adjective for the word clothing. I read NIV, and it says fine clothes. It says such as braided hair, the wearing of gold jewelry, and fine clothes. But that word "fine" is just something they've added in translation, and I'm not exactly sure why. But there's no adjective describing clothing in the original Greek text. So, if this verse was saying, "Women, do not braid your hair," "Women, do not wear gold jewelry," it is also saying, "Women, do not wear clothes." which would be awkward. So that is not what this is saying. If it is talking about, where is your basis of beauty? What are you basing your beauty on? And that it should not be based on the outward stuff, but it should be based on the inward stuff. There's so much pressure on women dealing with outward appearance. You know, your weight and your shape and your complexion and your hair, all this outward stuff, all this pressure that the society and Hollywood and culture puts on it. Even clothes and having what's in style and what's in fashion and all this kind of outward stuff, focusing. You know, most men here, and I'm not saying, you know, that it's everybody, most men here probably have 3 or 4 pairs of shoes, okay, in the closet, all right? Most women here, not to stereotype, most women here probably have 3 or 4 pairs of white shoes, 3 or 4 pairs of black shoes, 3 or 4 pairs of gray shoes. All right, so there's all this pressure that us guys don't necessarily have to live with based on the outward appearance. You guys have a lot of pressure in that department. But the Bible's telling us here that true beauty is based on the inner qualities. It's based on what's inside. And there's nothing wrong with, you know, wanting your hair and jewelry and clothes and all that stuff to look good, but that's not what beauty is based on. And we should spend much more time working on the inner self than we do working on the outer self. But that can seem kind of strange to the world. Because the world is so much just focused on how we look, what we wear, who we hang out with, what we drive. Everything is kind of focused on the outward and not the inward. But character, personality, our spirituality, those are the things that beauty is based on. So we need to spend our time working on becoming beautiful people and not just beautiful looking people. That your beauty should be based on those inner qualities. Before we get on to the men, one last idea to look at. This idea of a gentle and quiet spirit. In verse 4. The beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit. This adjective gentle is only found 3 times in the New Testament, and 2 of them refer to guess who? Jesus. See this theme? See all this negative stuff, this submission, this gentleness, this stuff that the world wants to package as negative and suppressive. All of this is pointing back to Jesus. But the noun form of the word, it doesn't appear more frequently in the New Testament. But the idea is not about being passive. It's not about being timid, unassertive. It's not about being nice. But the idea is this attitude of not demanding to get your way. It's about not being insistent on my rights, and this is my rights, this is what I want, this is the way I want it. It's about not demanding your way, your rights. It's the opposite of my way or the highway. That's what this word gentle and quiet spirit actually is meaning. It's just an attitude of not saying it's my way or else, but being willing to work and compromise and be that kind of gentle spirit. It's basically saying we shouldn't try to control our relationship, marriage or otherwise, any relationship. We shouldn't try to control other people by, guilting or nagging or bribing or tempting, all these things that we try to do, all of that kind of power plays that we can do in our relationships, wherever those relationships are. But to have a gentle spirit in your relationships. It's about a wife's attitude should not be, once he deserves respect, then I'll respect him. But to show respect and trust God to work things out. Ruth Graham, Billy Graham's wife, Ruth, she says this. She says, it's my job to love Billy. It's God's job to make him good. So that's what this passage is saying. See, what submission and a gentle spirit in a biblical relationship, it's just placing the other person in God's hands. I mean, it's more complicated than that, but the general idea is just that you can't change them, but you're trusting God to change them. So be responsible for your own attitude and your own behavior. That's a good place to move on to husbands. Now, one thing you're going to notice here is we have 6 whole verses directed towards the wives. And I don't know who, if you have it in front of you, how many verses do the men get? We get 1 short verse. Now, that is not because you women need so much more help than us guys do, all right? So I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but it's not because women need more work. It's not because there's more women in Peter's audience. But it's because I believe that God knows how men and women work and operate. You know, women use, on average, around 13,000 more words a day than men do. You guys just like more words, right? Us guys, we don't even like to read the instructions. That's too much words for us. So God knows, and He's inspiring Peter. As Peter's writing this, God's writing through Peter. He knows us guys keep it short and simple. Stupid is kind of what we need. All right. So there is just as much crammed into this one verse. There's just as much for us to take away with as the section is a paragraph for the women. God just knows He's got to get our attention while He has it, or we're going to lose it. So let's look at verse 7. Husbands, in the same way, I'm reading the NIV, but I'm going to criticize the NIV, so it's not going to match the thing. All right, but what's in front of me? It says, husbands, in the same way, be considerate as you live with your wives, and treat them with respect, as the weaker partner, and as heirs with you of the gracious gift of life, so that nothing will hinder your prayers. And we're going to look at the verse on the screen, and it's kind of the Brian Drum version, but I'm going to explain that in a little bit. But let's start with, in the same way. Same thing as, if we see that, we got to look, what's he talking about? So he just got to talk about wives. So in the same way as wives, but with the wives, he says in the same way as Christ. So husbands, we have the same example set before us. In the same way that Christ treated people, that is our challenge for our wives, for us to treat our wives in that same way. So again, this is not an authority thing, but it is a humble, servant-based thing, with that same attitude that Christ had. So we're to follow the examples of Christ and be the husbands that the daughters of God deserve. So let's look at what that entails here in verse 7. Now, I normally preach out of the NIV. Most of you are probably familiar with that. It's what I went through college with, and it's what I'm most familiar with and what I lean towards. I think it's a good, understandable version for most people to get kind of a good balance. But they don't do a very good job of with this passage. So we're going to you can take my word on this, and you can study it later on your own, or I can help you study it later on your own. But we're going to kind of address some of their translations here, I guess. All right. So this word considerate. It says, in the same way, be considerate as you live with your wives. Considerate's a horrible word to translate what this passage is trying to say. Because in our social context, we consider it to be nice, being kind, think about other people's feelings. You don't want to hurt people's feelings. Be considerate, you know. It's like the opposite of being rude. Be thinking about what, don't hurt the other people's feelings. Be kind, be nice. That's kind of what we link to considerate. But that is not what this Greek word is talking about. It literally means according to knowledge, or according to understanding. So what Peter is saying is, husbands, live with your wives according to knowledge, or according to understanding. And you see how that's kind of a weird English translation. It's like, what exactly does that mean? All right, understanding, what knowledge? Live with your wives according to what knowledge? So first of all, the knowledge of God's purposes and principles for marriage. What's God's plan for marriage? What's His values for marriage? Have knowledge of that. But also, have knowledge of your wife. Her desires, her goals, her frustrations, her strengths, her weaknesses, her dreams. According to the knowledge of live with your wife according to the knowledge of her. The best way to be the best husband, the best way to love your wife is to know your wife. And knowledge is gained by spending time together and by studying them. Husbands, we need to be students of our wives. We need to study them. We need to know them. Most of you guys thought you were out of school, right? And I'm not talking about their favorite colors or their favorite restaurants. That's like high school diploma level, okay? We need to be working, and we're talking higher education here. We're talking about their hopes and their dreams, their fears, their frustrations, their strengths, the things that they're good at and excel at. Maybe they don't even know their strengths. So we need to be students of our wives and get to know them so we can meet their needs. One of man's biggest emotional needs is to be respected. But one of woman's biggest emotional needs is to feel known, to feel understood. It's not so much about what you say, but it's do you understand what I'm saying or what I'm feeling. So if you feel like you have an associate's degree, then go for a bachelor's degree. And if you feel like you have a bachelor's, go for a master's degree. We all have room to grow and to learn and to study your wife. That's what God is telling us in this verse, really. It's not just be considerate with your wife. It's to study your wife, to know her, to live with her in an understanding way, understanding what makes her tick, understand how she's wired, understand what her needs are. Then he says, and treat them with respect. Okay, I don't like that either. All right. Respect, again, it's too weak of a translation here. A stronger word is honor. Okay? Because respect, it just sounds like you're being polite. Honor is stronger. Not only that, but there's a public aspect to this idea. Meaning that and it's something that us men aren't very good at. Again, I talked about we're not as verbal as the ladies, and we're just not good at expressing things. Like we can get together with the guys and we can groan and complain about our wives. We can sometimes joke at their expense. But not very often do we publicly praise, publicly honor our wives. And in front of them, in front of our peers, talking about their qualities. I mean, think back when you were first dating your future wife. You know, and you were so excited and you were so proud. I mean, you wanted to show her off, to everybody. And so if she was there, you were showing her off. If she wasn't there, you were telling people how amazing, how beautiful, how smart, how funny, how talented. You were telling her all these things, because you wanted the world to know how amazing your girlfriend was. And then we get married, and slowly, not intentionally, just some of that dulls away, and we lose that. But this word about respect, treat them with respect, treat them with honor. There's a public aspect to that. As husbands, we need to publicly affirm, compliment our wives. And when we become husbands, we slowly let too much of that die, unfortunately. Then he talks about, NIV says, treat them with respect as the weaker partner. I don't like that either. I promise you, I like the NIV, I really do. I just don't know what happened in 1 Peter chapter 3. That word partner, it's really the word vessel. So picture, this is back in Bible times, picture, a piece of pottery, a vase, or a pitcher or something. And so it's a vessel, and the idea, it's not saying that women are weak or fragile or frail or are any lesser. That's really not the idea. I mean, even though the word picture is a fragile vessel, but the idea is not about being less valuable. It's actually the opposite. It's about being very valuable. And we had this curio cabinet in our house, and it's a curved glass doors on the front of it or whatever, and I was so nervous. Of all the pieces of furniture we were moving from Georgia, this is the piece I was so nervous about, and I was stressing about where it was going to fit, and if it fit in the van, or if we'd have to go in the moving van, and how we were going to pack it, or whatever. We just had to be so careful. And it made it. It made it in one piece. So your house. We'll have to show it to you. But that's the idea here. It's not that women are weak and frail, but it's that we want to be careful with our wives. We want to treat them with so much value. It's not, the idea is about not being careless. So don't take advantage of your wife. Don't abuse your authority, whether it's emotionally or physically or financially or sexually. Don't be careless with how you treat your wife. That's the idea of this weaker vessel. It's not an insult. It's just a charge to men to not be careless with how we treat them. All right, men, are you still awake? All right. For us, this should be one of the scariest phrases in the Bible. Where Peter ends here, he says, I'm just going to read the whole thing of the story. All right. So husbands, in the same way, live with your wives according to knowledge, and treat them with honor, as weaker vessels, and as co-heirs with you. So we're co-heirs, we're together. We're not spiritually, there's no spiritual hierarchy. We're co-heirs of the grace of God. But here's the phrase I'm talking about. So that nothing will hinder your prayers. So that nothing will hinder your prayers. Directed towards husbands, our prayer lives can be affected by how we treat our wives. That should scare our socks off. All right? I don't understand how this works in the spiritual realm, but it's almost as if God is saying, come back to me when you know how to treat your wife. Scary verse. So strange wives, strange husbands, when we implement some of these things, this is God's ideal, this is God's goal for us. And the world might think it's strange to give yourself totally to somebody else, but it's God's call to us. So if we are Christians and we are married, it's our goal to have that kind of marriage, to be the kind of husband or wife that Christ calls us to be. Things like submission, unconditional love that may seem strange to the world, and we're never going to get it totally right. Marriage is two sinful people trying to coexist in the same roof, under the same roof. So we're not going to get it right. But it's not our responsibility to change our spouse, but to change ourselves more into what the husband or wife we're supposed to be, and leave them to God. And really, whether you're married or not, that's good advice for our relationships. We have, to be in prayer and to let God work on those people in our lives that need it. And the key to that is to belong to Jesus yourself. So if you're here this morning and you don't belong to Jesus, that's the first step. Before you worry about anybody else and anybody else's problems, do you belong to Jesus? How are you doing? Let's pray. Father God, thank you so much. Thank you for the blessing that is my wife. And I just humbly ask for your help in being the husband that I need to be. Pray for all the marriages here at Zoah. And the church is, family is the foundation of the church. We are one big family, but we're made up of families. And family is the most important foundation of our church. As I pray for our marriages, I just pray that you would bind Satan, that Satan would not be able to hinder, to tempt, to draw away the faithful couples that we have here in our church, Lord, that you would just bind Satan's hands, that he could not destroy our marriages, that we'd be able to stand strong and stand firm, love each other. Pray for those who are single and maybe looking for a person. I just pray that you would give them wisdom and patience, and help them to work on themselves first, and you can work on who's to come into their lives. Lord, for all of us, let our number one relationship be our love with you. In your Son's name we pray. Amen. Would you stand with us? that. Don't forget sign-up sheets in the narthex for the men's and women's Bible studies and the canoe trip are out there. And teachers, don't forget your stuff, your goodies. So, all right, let's pray. Father God, just pray for your blessing as we leave this place, that we would be able to be salt and light unto a world that needs it. And as we go about our days, live lives pleasing and worthy